We now turn to David Brooks' sociological work, Bobos in Paradise, trying to understand what the American ruling elite looks like in the 1990s. Brooks does something quite comical at the beginning of his book, but something that really tells us about who we are. He says, you know who rules a society, so to speak, by who is able to make it into the New York Times wedding page. Now, I say this with humor because my wife, when we got married, tried to get us into that wedding page. And even though our eyes were lined up correctly and we put on our Sunday best, we did not make it in, which kind of shows you that Professor Corbin is not one of the ruling elite. However, who has ruled the United States? And how do we see the difference between one set of ruling elite and another over the ages? So here Brooks does something interesting. He says, if you took a look at the wedding pages of the New York Times in the 1950s, here's what you would find out. Most of the married couples define themselves, define their excellence based upon their bloodline, based upon their tie to this family or that family. So in the 1950s, we see, right, that this WASP, this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant directive defines the 1950s elite. Something changes, however, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It's very, very important. He says that as we turn to standardized tests to figure out who gains admission into the Ivy League colleges, that SAT begins to change the American ruling elite. Those who score better on the SAT and gain entry into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other universities will then take over the institutions in the country. So you go from a more aristocratic elite to a meritocratic elite based upon test scores until you get to the late 1960s and early 1970s, this period of revolution and rebellion. Well, we find out, Brooks says, that these wedding pages in the 1960s became much shorter, much more abridged, because the ruling elite did not want to be identified as such in this time period. So you wouldn't put your name in to get in the New York Times, because if you were doing so, that would be being considered bourgeois. So instead of being bourgeois, the elite at this time moved towards a more bohemian outlook upon the world. But then he tells us that this group of young men and women in the 1970s who were in their 20s, mid-20s, they eventually find themselves in positions of authority and power in American society. They eventually find themselves with larger and larger bank accounts. So they hold on to the bohemian values of the 1960s, but we have a mix between a bohemian value system and a bourgeois bank account, what he calls the Bobo. Now, the Bobo is the individual who rules American society in the 1980s and 90s. And what does a Bobo look like? Well, a Bobo is someone who will go out and buy a luxurious car, but make sure that that luxurious car is environmentally sound, right? So you have the desire to want to own something that is excellent, but you want to make sure that while you're doing well, you're doing good by others. He says that the wedding pages of today deal with kind of mixtures of these two types of people. What he calls, on one hand, kind of the more nurturing spouse, and then the predatorial spouse. So you'll have a lawyer that marries a social worker. You'll have a banker, right, who marries a nonprofit advocate. So you have these mixing of couples that suggest what? That perhaps a consensus has been formed. And what does that consensus look like? It looks like the following. With regard to economic matters or material matters, there's no problem in being wealthy as long as you want to share the wealth with others. With regard to ideational, moral, or philosophic matters, you can have your own vision of what is right, as what is good. Just don't take that vision and try to imprint it upon another. So there's indeterminacy within the ideational realm, but determinacy within the material realm. And the admixing of these two things produces a happiness for the type of person who wants to rule, but rule in a way where they don't look like they're ruling over others. Brooks's Bobos in Paradise shows us the paradise that Bobos have created for themselves. And by the way, I think it's a paradise that still is very much in effect today in the year 2020. Do you know a Bobo?